On a cold November morning in 1620, just outside of Prague, an entire army collapsed in about an hour. Their king fled so fast that Europe mocked him as the Winter King, since his reign lasted only one season. Within a year, 27 rebel leaders were executed in Prague's Old Town Square, and today tourists walk over 27 white crosses embedded in the cobblestones, oblivious to the fact that they mark the death of Bohemian independence. This is the Battle of White Mountain, a short, brutal clash that reshaped Central Europe for the next 300 years. For centuries, Central Europe has been at the epicenter of conflict in Europe. Empires, religions, and armies grinding against one another, pushing borders back and forth. In the middle of this storm are the Czechs, a small nation populated with strong and resilient people who have persisted while many other kingdoms disappeared. At the start of the 17th century, Bohemia, with Prague at its heart, was ruled by Catholic Habsburgs. On paper, the king was Emperor Rudolf II, a Catholic. But most of the Bohemian nobles were Protestant, and they wanted guarantees that their faith and their rights would be protected. In 1609, under intense pressure and already slipping into mental illness, Rudolf signed a document called the Letter of Majesty. It granted Bohemian nobles and towns the right to worship freely and to run their own church affairs. For Protestants, this was a constitutional shield. For Rudolf, it felt like a surrender, and he soon regretted it and grew even more suspicious of his Protestant subjects. As Rudolf's mind deteriorated, he became politically paralyzed. He refused to govern, distrusted everyone, and managed to alienate both Catholic and Protestant leaders. Power began to slip away from him. Sensing weakness, his Catholic cousin, Archduke Matthias, made a bold move. And in 1608, he formed a coalition of archdukes who forced Rudolf to hand over control of Hungary, Austria, and Moravia to Matthias. Rudolf held on to Bohemia, including Prague, for the time being. Many Protestant leaders, exhausted by the chaos, decided that Matthias was the lesser of two evils. They hoped he would at least bring stability and respect the Letter of Majesty. However, in 1611, Matthias marched into Prague and Rudolf was placed under armed confinement within his own castle. Matthias eventually became king of Bohemia by forcing Rudolf to surrender the Bohemian crown. And when Rudolf died the following year, Matthias also became Holy Roman Emperor. At first it looked like Bohemia might get the stability it wanted, but in 1617, Matthias chose as his successor to the Bohemian crown his cousin Ferdinand, a hardline Catholic devoted to reversing the spread of Protestantism and the rollback of Protestant rights, known as the Counter-Reformation. The mostly Protestant Bohemian estates accepted Ferdinand only reluctantly. His reputation terrified them, and they feared, quite correctly, that the promises in the Letter of Majesty would soon be ignored. Tension in Bohemia rose sharply. A year later, in May 1618, it finally exploded. A group of angry Protestant nobles marched into the Prague castle to confront the royal governors, who they believed were helping Ferdinand undermine their rights. The argument turned violent, and the nobles seized two governors and their secretary and hurled them out of a high window more than 20 meters above the ground. Against all odds, the men survived the fall. Catholics later said they were saved by angels. Protestants joked that they landed in a pile of dung. Either way, the third defenestration of Prague had happened, and with it came open revolt. Bohemian nobles raised their own army. They formed a new government and effectively broke with Habsburg rule. All of Europe was now watching closely. In March 1619, Emperor Matthias died. The Bohemian estates refused to recognize his chosen successor, Ferdinand, as their king. Instead, they elected a Protestant prince, Frederick V, as King of Bohemia. Frederick was young, idealistic, and had powerful Protestant allies, but he was also inexperienced and overly confident. That same year, despite the Bohemian Rebellion, Ferdinand was elected Holy Roman Emperor. Now two rival kings claimed Bohemia, one backed by Catholic powers, the other by Protestants. The struggle for Prague and Bohemia was no longer local. It was part of a much larger conflict that would eventually become the 30 Years' War. The war would soon ignite into violence on a low, wooded plateau just west of Prague, a place called Bila Hora, White Mountain. In the early morning mist on November the 8th, 1620, the Catholic Imperial Army advanced towards Prague. Around 23,000 men, German, Italian, Spanish, and Bavarian troops, marched in solid columns. Among them were heavy cuirassiers with steel breastplates, dragoons, light cavalry, and artillery crews armed with between 12 to 14 cannons. These guns would have a huge psychological impact, easily as important as the physical damage they inflicted. Their goal was to smash the rebel army before it could fall back and defend the city. The Bohemian army, slightly smaller and in poor condition, took up defensive positions on the ridge near the Star Hunting Lodge, a distinctive star-shaped building that still stands today. If you ever visit Prague, you can walk up to that lodge and stand on the ground where this battle unfolded more than 400 years ago. On paper, the Bohemian position wasn't bad. They held the high ground. But their army was a patchwork of unpaid mercenaries and reluctant allies. Many soldiers were cold, hungry, and demoralized. Leadership was divided. The overall commander, Christian of Anhalt, was a capable statesman but not a seasoned fighting man. His son led much of the cavalry, but he also lacked experience. Critically, the Bohemian king, Frederick V, was nowhere near the front. Lacking military skill and perhaps courage, he remained in Prague instead of on the battlefield, leaving his army to face the oncoming storm without their monarch. As the morning wore on, the Imperial and Catholic League forces reached the Bohemian line. The first skirmishes broke out in mid-morning on the Bohemian left flank, held by some of the least reliable units on the Protestant side. These men were cold, unpaid, and in no mood to die for a cause they barely believed in. Catholic commanders quickly sensed this weakness. Johann Cercles, the Count of Tilly, ordered repeated probing attacks against that left flank. When he saw how easily the defenders gave ground, he reinforced the assault with the veteran Bavarian infantry, men in blue coats armed with pikes and muskets, drilled to fight as a unit. The Bohemian commanders responded with a counterattack on that same flank, and for a brief moment it looked promising. Their cavalry surged forward and pushed back the attackers. But then the Imperial cuirassiers arrived, heavily armed, disciplined shock cavalry. They smashed into the Bohemian horsemen, shattered the counterattack, and sent the Protestant cavalry into retreat. This was the turning point. Once the left began to crumble, Tilly pushed even harder. Bavarian infantry continued to advance, pikes lowered, musketeers ready. Artillery crews dragged their guns closer. Bohemian artillery was badly positioned and soon ran low on powder. Their musketeers lacked training and discipline. Under cannon fire and steady infantry pressure, the Bohemian line began to weaken. By around noon, large sections of the Bohemian army had broken. Some units were cut down where they stood. Many more simply turned and fled towards Prague. Panic spread faster than battlefield communication. Officers struggled to rally their men, but in many places, command completely collapsed. In roughly 1 hour of serious fighting, the fate of Bohemia was sealed. The casualty count tells the story. Estimates vary, but in less than an hour, around 2,500 to 4,000 Bohemian soldiers were killed or wounded. On the Catholic side, less than a quarter that number fell. The Imperial and Catholic League army had won a clear, crushing victory through better discipline, stronger leadership, and superior cavalry. The next day, those victorious troops marched into Prague almost unopposed. Frederick V fled the city with his family, heading into exile. His reign as King of Bohemia had lasted barely a single winter. Europe would forever remember him as the Winter King. The Bohemian Revolt collapsed. Protestant self-government in Bohemia was destroyed. Cities surrendered, and remaining resistance melted away. Emperor Ferdinand wanted to send a message, not just to Bohemia, but to all of Europe. In June of 1621, he staged a brutal public spectacle in Prague's Old Town Square. 27 leaders of the revolt, nobles, knights, scholars, and city officials, were executed one after the other. Today, that moment is remembered by 27 small white crosses set into the pavement of the square. Tourists walk all over them without ever noticing, let alone understanding what they mean. As for Bila Hora itself, White Mountain is no towering peak. It's a modest ridge beside a highway leading from Prague's airport into the city. Trees, houses, traffic, the usual clutter of modern life. Its violent past is easy to miss. But on that ridge, in the space of about an hour, Bohemia lost its independence. The victory at White Mountain allowed the Habsburgs to tighten their grip, enforce Catholic rule, and reshape the political and religious map of Central Europe for the next 300 years.